Hello, Advanced Ninth. How are y'all doing? I hope you had a wonderful spring break and that you're ready for us to get going here with Phase 2. You started out yesterday by completing the Explication assignment, and you had to upload the typed document to turn it in by midnight on Wednesday night, April 8th. So if you haven't done that yet, you have to do that first before listening to this explanation of the poem, okay? So make sure you do that. So today is Thursday, April 9th. We're going to be going through and talking about the poem and going over your explication assignment. So if you've got that pulled up, you can check your answers and see how you did and how close you got with it. This was a tough one. I love Dickinson. And then just don't forget, you've got one more opportunity to get some more meming practice in. As long as you've got your 6, and that's going all the way back to March 13th. So most of you probably do. And then tomorrow, when you get up, or, well, unless you get up at the crack of dawn, tomorrow by 9, you'll see your meming quiz up and ready for you to go, okay? All right, so let's get going. I love Emily Dickinson. She is a very complex poet. She does so much with very few words, and this to me is one of her tougher ones. Some of hers are a little easier to understand, but this one's super tough, and part of it is because it is so elliptical in nature, meaning it leaves out words. So this is a fun one to really kind of dig into, which is one of the things I enjoy about poetry explication, really sort of stretching your mind and trying to figure out what the poet is trying to get across to you, okay? So Dickinson did not actually title any of her poems. She didn't publish poems while she was alive. They were published after her death. And so most Dickinson poems are just titled by whatever her first line is for ease of identification. So this one is titled, Much Madness is Divinest Sense. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous, and handled with a chain. Okay, so what I told you to do first was to go through and look up any unfamiliar words and write the definitions down below it, so hopefully you did that. And then I told you to kind of just give me your first impressions before you really start digging into it. Just at face value, did you think the poem was about? So that could be anything, just whatever you thought at first. So then I asked you to go through and sort of break it down, paraphrasing or summarizing what each of the sets of lines mean. And this should have helped you a little bit, the fact that I broke it up for you. And if you notice, there's a pattern there. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Because that's kind of how the thoughts run in the poem. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. Okay. Now, one of the first things you should have noticed visually, just by looking at the poem, is the dashes, right? She's known for her dashes. And what that does is it creates a pause in the poem. So you have it's almost very, it gives you a tempo that's very sort of halting, almost hesitant. And so, you're left wondering, is the speaker scared to speak? Is the speaker hesitant to say whatever it is that they're trying to get across? But that's what those dashes kind of create there so it almost feels like a secret is being shared, or perhaps they're telling us something that they could get in trouble for, or something like that. Okay, so starts out by saying, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. So hopefully, even though those seem like simple words, they're deceptively simple. So hopefully you did take the time to look up a few of these if it was being used in an unfamiliar way to you. Madness, of course, here means insanity, right? Not like fury. It means insanity. So what she's saying is that much madness, much insanity, is actually divinest sense, the divine, coming from God, to a discerning eye. And did you look up discerning? So that's somebody who can kind of see through the ruses, see through the cover, see through whatever kind of facade we want to put up, right? Someone who has the power of discernment can see the truth of someone, okay? So what she's basically saying here and if you could write this down, is that much that seems crazy is actually sense if you look closely. I got a new pen, but it still doesn't write great. So hopefully you can read that chicken scratch, okay? So many things that seem to be crazy are actually make a lot of sense to a discerning eye, to somebody who's looking through it. And then much sense, the starkest madness, okay? So that one line sort of pivots off of that. So basically what she's saying there is much that is called sense is crazy. Okay? So I think it would help if we kind of put this into, if we kind of like extrapolate it out and think about how could this be true? If this is a true statement that our speaker is telling us here, in what way could that be true? So how could it be that something that seemed crazy might actually be God-given sense to a discerning eye, to somebody who's really looking past the surface? Well, there's lots of different examples, but one example I could think of is first of all, imagine we were not in the middle of this, COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, craziness that the world's going through right now. But imagine it's just a normal school day, and you and your friends are at school, and your best friend comes up to you, and they've got a bag, and they're giving you a bunch of their stuff, like, they're really nice stuff, and you're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you giving me this? What's going on? And they're like, well, I'm not going to need it anymore. My family and I have decided that we are going to travel the country just in our vehicle. We're selling the house. We're selling all of our stuff. We're each allowed to bring one bag of essentials, but we're selling and giving away everything else, and we're just going to travel the country and tell people about Jesus. We're leaving tomorrow. Okay? What would your first reaction probably be to that? That's crazy, right? Wouldn't that be your first reaction? Like, that's crazy. What about school? What about your parents' jobs? What are you going to do for money? How is this going to work? But, if you read the Bible, if you are a Christian, then isn't that what Jesus asks people to do? You know what I mean? So that's what I mean, that, our initial reaction as an American living in 2020 would be like, that's crazy. Nobody does that. But when you really stop and think about it, you could see like, oh, well, okay, I see that, you're strong in your faith and you believe you're being called to do this. Okay, I guess that does make sense. And then on the flip side, some things that we think or sense could actually be the starkest madness. I'll give you a great example of that, and that's medicine through the ages, right? Like if we look back 500 years ago at their medical procedures, we're like, what were they doing? They were crazy. Like pretty much any medical complaint you went to the doctor with, they're like, well, better cut you with this rusty knife. Put your arm over this bowl. I'm going to bleed you. Sure, that'll make you feel better, no matter what it was. And who knows how many additional germs they were putting in your bloodstream with that knife that hasn't been cleaned, in 2 years. But that's what they thought was top medicine at that time. And so it makes you wonder, like, what are people going to look back on us years from now, centuries from now, and be like, that was insane. Why did they do that? The best example I can think of, having witnessed my mom go through it firsthand with breast cancer, is chemotherapy. I mean, obviously right now that's the best defense we have against cancer, and that's what we use, but it's literally poison. You're literally putting poison into your body to kill the cancer, but it kills a lot of other healthy cells too, which is why, people lose their hair and their appetite goes down, and, they look very sickly, like they're being poisoned, because they are. And so obviously that's the best we have right now. So that's what we do. But just imagine 300 years in the future, surely there'll be some better cure or medicine for cancer, and they'll look back on us and be like, what were those crazy people thinking? They poisoned themselves to get rid of cancer. So, but right now, it seems like sense to us because that's the best we have, right? But later, I'm sure people will look back and think, oh, that's crazy. So, basically, that was a tangent, but basically just trying to get you to understand the concept here of what she's talking about with the fact that madness can actually be sense, and sense can actually be madness. Okay, so how do we know which is which then? Well, she tells us that in the next 2 lines. 'Tis the majority in this as all prevail. Prevail meaning win. So it's the majority that wins or prevails or decides, right? Why? What do they mean? Well, if it's something that everybody's doing, then people think, okay, well, that makes sense. That's fine. That's not insane. That's normal. I'll give you a good example of that, too. I have to wear a mask every spring when I go out at this time of year because the pollen count's so high and my allergies are so bad. And people look at me like I'm a lunatic. Well, these days, if I have to go out and pick up my Kroger Click List or whatever, nobody bats an eye because everybody has masks on, right? Because we're all trying to be very careful. So now the majority has decided, oh, wearing masks is normal. That's good. That makes sense. But, in years past when I've had to wear my mask, people look at me crazy. So it's the majority that decides. It's the majority that wins and prevails. Whatever the majority of the people think sanity is, that's what we agree is sane, And there's so many examples. I've just given you a couple, but I'm sure you can think of more examples of something that we all do, or most people do, but if you really stop and think about it, you're like, isn't that kind of crazy? And so she goes on to say, if you assent, you are sane. So to assent, right, means what? To agree with. So if you agree with what? The majority. If you agree, then you consider sane. So as long as you agree with what the majority of the people are doing, if you are doing pretty much the same thing that the majority of the people are doing, then people are like, oh, okay, well, they're sane, they're normal, that's what we're all doing, okay? If you start talking to trees, then people might look at you funny. But if you're just doing, talking to your dog, we all talk to our dogs. So everybody's like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That's not weird at all. Okay? Now, here's a lot. I don't know how many of y'all haven't looked at your responses yet because it's still Wednesday here in recording world. But I'm wondering if y'all picked up on this, that the key word here, the most important choice in diction is that word demure, because you assent and you're sane, right? Assent means to agree with. What is the opposite of assent? What's the antonym, right? It's dissent. Like you talk about a dissenting vote in the Supreme Court, and that's to disagree with, okay? So, logically, when she's talking about this, what you would have thought she would have said is if you assent or agree with the majority, you're considered sane. If you dissent or disagree, you're considered dangerous and insane. But she didn't use dissent. She used demure. Well, what does demure mean? Demure has a very different connotation, or actually denotation, than dissent. To demure is not to straight out disagree with. To demure is kind of to hedge the question. Like, has anybody ever been talking to you about something that they believe passionately in, but you don't really agree with them? Like, it could be politics or religion or the best way to raise a child or what you should do for a living. I mean, it can be anything. And they're very passionate about what they're saying, but you don't really agree with them, or maybe you don't really care one way or the other, but you don't want to get into an argument with them, so you're just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess I could see that. And you don't really come out and disagree with them, but you don't really agree with them either. That's to demure, okay? So to demur is to kind of like deflect the question, okay? Or maybe even just ask a question, you know? Like, maybe even just to say, like, well, are we sure that's right? Are we sure that's the best thing to do? That's not disagreeing, is it? That's not a dissent. That's just, are we sure? Should we think about this again? Should we maybe take a minute and, like, reconsider? That's what demur is. So I think this is super important here, that you don't even have to dissent to be considered dangerous and handled with a chain. In other words, insane. In other words, like a beast, right? Like someone who does not have reason and has to be chained up for their own safety or the safety of others. You think about movies you've seen that has the criminally insane, and they're like straitjacketed and all this kind of stuff, or maybe even in chains. So you don't even have to completely disagree. Just to demur with the majority can get you handled with a chain, considered dangerous, treated like a beast, right? All right, so that's our breakdown of what each of the lines mean. How much of that did you get? I can't wait to read your responses. So looking at number 2, now that you've paraphrased the poem, did your idea of what the poem means stay the same, or did it change? And so obviously you'll just be responding there, looking back at your answer for number 1. Number 3 asks, why is this poem a good example of elliptical wording? Elliptical means leaving words out, and she leaves out a lot of words. That's just a technique that Dickinson uses a lot, where she leaves stuff out, and we have to go in and kind of fill in the blanks in order to understand exactly what she's saying. For instance, with our textual evidence there, much sense the starkest madness is a good example, right? Where she's saying that much madness is actually divinest sense to a discerning eye, but much sense would be considered starkest madness. You see what I'm saying? So she's leaving out words there. That's the elliptical construction. Looking at the poem on the page, we already talked about this. She's got the dashes are a big thing, right? And it gives that very hesitant tempo, but also look at her unusual capitalization, right? She's got weird words capitalized throughout, and that's another very common thing that Dickinson does. And she, along with Whitman, they were both writing around the time of the Civil War, and it's very much something that was a precursor of what would become modern poetry. She was a huge influencer for like E.E. Cummings, for example, who was writing in the early 1900s. Okay, what about the meter of the poem? We've already talked about this. I went over this already. This is where we were talking about the dashes and how it leads it to be very hesitant and halting. And you can see why she would be very hesitant and halting, right? Because what she's revealing is a truth that if you don't agree with the majority, you could wind up handled with a chain, okay? So obviously that is something that she would sort of haltingly talk about. And then this one we've just talked about too. Diction is really important. And again, it's that word, the fact that she did not use the word dissent. The obvious word would be or the obvious choice would be to use the opposite of assent and to use that word dissent. Because those are antonyms, but she doesn't do that. She uses the word demur. You don't even have to come out and strongly disagree. You can just demur, and you're going to be considered dangerous, you know. Well, I'll give you the perfect example. Think about Animal Farm. Remember whenever Squealer was trying to tell everybody that Snowball had been in with Jones from the beginning and was never a loyal member of Animal Farm, and Boxer was like, well, I don't think so. Like, I remember him, I think I remember him being good in the beginning, but later, yeah, you're right. See, he didn't come out and directly disagree with him. He's just demurring, and then what happened? He got the dog sicked on him, right? So it can be dangerous. So then lastly, is there an overall moral or theme to the poem? Or in other words, what's the underlying message? Well, the biggest message here is that if you're going to go against the majority, you have to be careful, right? The majority likes everybody else to fall in line with them and think the same way they do and act the same way they do. And if you want to do something different, you're going to be looked at as strange or crazy, and possibly it could even harm you. And so that's that underlying message, that we as humans get really into this concept of conformity. And so when someone's going against what we think is normal or right or sane, we give them the side eye pretty quickly, don't we? Okay? So, I hope you had a good time with that poem. I know it was a tough one, but hopefully you enjoyed the explication of it and the explanation. And I will talk to you again soon. Take care.